Hello and welcome. My name is Maria from Sew Through Time, and this time we're making an 1890s walking skirt and talking about, first of all, what is a walking skirt and how an 1890s walking skirt differs from an early Edwardian walking skirt or early 20th century walking skirt. Before the Victorian era, women's clothing was primarily defined by the level of formality of the garment, not necessarily for what type of activity it was meant for or what type of time of day it was referred to. So you'd wear pretty much a very similar formal gown for both formal daytime as you'd wear for formal evening. Whereas in the Victorian era, one way, because fabric was becoming, even though it was still expensive, it was becoming a little bit more cheaper, so that more people were starting to afford to buy better fabrics and more fabrics. And also, because of the rise of the middle class, a lot more people had more money to spare in general for things like clothing. So because of this, one way to distinct yourself from working class or even middle class who had to still do some physical activity, some housework or other chores and things that the upper classes didn't need to do, one way to very distinctly differentiate yourself from the other classes is by wearing clothes that are completely impractical for doing any sort of physical activity or any sort of work. And because of this, there was a change of garments becoming so elaborate and impractical for basically anything besides just sitting around that there became very specific garments for specific purposes. And that's why the walking skirt was born. Walking skirts were basically meant for, you guessed it, walking. So it could be walking around a city, strolling, or it could be more athletic, like actually going on a hike, or even walking skirts were used for light sports like tennis and other things when you didn't necessarily have a specific tennis outfit. Especially when you're middle class, you wouldn't necessarily have for every single activity a specific garment. Then you'd have a walking skirt that worked for everything from going to the shops to playing tennis. And because of this, the walking skirt became kind of this umbrella for everything a bit more active, things that you need to actually be able to move in. So they tended to be more simple than the more fancy gowns. And then, of course, upper classes, to distinguish them, blah, 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 blah. And then, of course, upper classes would come up with a lot of different variations. And there was, for instance, a promenade dress that is slightly different from the walking dress, even though both are meant for walking. But we're not getting into that right now, because we're talking now about the walking skirt. And that it's a fairly plain garment that usually was actually capable of you being active in. It wouldn't have all those trims and ruffles that sometimes were fashionable. The shape would be the kind not too narrow, not too wide, that it wouldn't hinder your movement, but it would still definitely be a fashionable garment, and it would keep up with whatever was the fashion of the time. And in the 1890s, the fashionable silhouette was an extreme hourglass. Now, this extreme hourglass was not necessarily made by making the waist extremely small, but rather having puffed sleeves, making the shoulders broader and arms broader, and then emphasizing the bust, and then emphasizing the hips and having the skirts flare out in an A-line straight from the hips, so that it would make your upper body bigger, your shoulders bigger, so by comparison, your waist looks tiny. And because this silhouette, though it's quite voluminous in skirts, it tends to be rather practical in general, so there isn't a huge difference in skirts in this era. Most skirts tend to be pretty much the same shape. The biggest difference between a walking skirt and an evening skirt is that an evening skirt could have a train and the materials used. Walking skirts were made out of practical materials, often darker colors, things that can be washed or brushed clean so that they wouldn't get dirty the same way as an evening gown would if you'd wear it walking around a dusty street. And because of this practicality in mind, they used definitely darker colors, but also materials could be washable or then brushable, like for instance a lot of wool and a lot of silk. Especially silk taffeta was very common for walking skirts, as well as of course fancier wear, because taffeta is a tightly woven fabric. So a lot of times if you get dust and dirt from walking around in a dusty road, you can just brush it off. There isn't anything that remains on the garment because of the tight weave of the silk. Other than silk and wool, of course, walking skirts were made out of cotton and different kinds of blends. In the very late 90s, you also start seeing the first man-made fibers. These are not yet the plastic fibers, but different sort of rayon type of fibers. And they start to be also mixed in with natural fibers. So you get all kinds of blends. So walking skirts are definitely not a boring garment, even though they are a practical garment. A walking skirt as a specific kind of separate garment from other clothing continues all the way to the 1920s, when hems start to be so short in general that there isn't really a need for a separate walking skirt. Just a skirt is good enough. It doesn't matter if you're indoors or outdoors, you can wear the same kind of skirt. Probably the most distinguishing difference between a walking skirt in the Edwardian era and the late Victorian era is that in the 1890s, a walking skirt is never trained. It is always what is called a round skirt. That means that the hem is even all the way around. Whereas in Edwardian era, you could have trained walking skirts. They were still a more practical garment. The kind of fabrics that would be used for trained walking skirts would be the kind where dirt wouldn't show easily, and the kind that wouldn't gather up huge amounts of dust, and the trains would be fairly moderate sized, but they still could exist. Skirts of the 1890s had always a bigger skirt in the back than the actual waistband size, so that the back piece would be either pleated or gathered somehow to match the waist size. Whereas by 98 or 99, you start already seeing the Edwardian shape, which can be either pleated or it can be a so-called habit back. That means that the back side is also gored in a way that the waist size matches the actual waist size on the skirt. Now, in the Edwardian era, if a skirt is bigger in the back than it is at the waist size, it is always pleated. And usually it's pleated in an inverted pleat or inverted box pleat, or some sort of mixture of that. But the pleats are fairly flat and not very noticeable. Whereas an 1890s skirt can have those inverted box pleats or inverted pleats, but it can also have several pleats in a row forming big box pleats in the back, or it can be also gathered. And like I already mentioned, that in the 1890s, skirts are never trained, and they tend to be, if they're walking skirt, they can vary anywhere from floor length to about ankle length if they're meant for good weather. Then there is specific garments that are meant for a specific sporting activity, for instance, riding a bike, or for bad weather, and those of course could be shorter. You wouldn't wear a floor-length walking skirt if it's raining outside. But in the Edwardian era, they can go anywhere from that trained length to even floor length, or even a few inches above the ankle. It can even be that 1 or 2 inches above the ankle, even if it's meant for actually just walking, not a specific sport, or specifically for bad weather. 1890s skirts tend to be on the rather wider A-line kind of shape, so that they can be somewhere from about 4 yards to 5.5 yards at the hem, and they're always fairly straight A-line gores until you get to that very, very last year of the 1890s where you start seeing the Edwardian shape. Edwardian shape, it can be that fairly straight A-line, but they tend to be, if they are A-line shaped, they tend to be a little bit more narrow, somewhere between 3 yards to 4.5 typically. And if they are wider than that, especially when you get into that 5-yard range, they tend to be trumpet shaped. That means that it flares with your hips and it follows very closely to your hip line, and then it can even narrow a little bit at your thighs after, like, it gets wider with your hips, and then it can even get a little narrower or stay the same, and then it really flares out, usually at about knee level. But even if the general shape of the skirt is a typical A-line shape, where the panels aren't super wide, but they aren't very narrow either, you can usually tell whether it is an Edwardian or a Victorian one, because the shape that the garment actually has on a person is usually different. The 1890s version is usually a lot more flared, and whereas the volume tends to be in the back in the Edwardian era, and tends to be very straight and narrow in the front and sides. And the difference with this is not always in the patterning. It is also in how the garment is made. Because in the 1890s, dresses and skirts tend to be flat-lined. They have usually that a little bit crisper structure layer in there that gives them that shape and helps keeps the gores flared out. Whereas typically an Edwardian skirt doesn't have this lining. If it has a lining, it is usually a separate drop lining, so that it means it's basically a petticoat that is just attached to the same waistband as the skirt. And another thing to help give that typical silhouette of both eras is the hem facing. In 1890s skirts, hem facings tend to be stiffer and they tend to be bigger. They are usually from 4 inches to anywhere to 15 inches, sometimes even 20 inches, so that they really help spread out evenly all the way around that hem. Whereas Edwardian hem facings tend to be lighter materials, softer materials. Like, for instance, flannel is a very typical material that isn't really, heavily structured, but it will give the hem still some body. And the hem facings tend to be only 3 to 4 inches, sometimes 5, but not usually bigger than that. Now, as far as hems go, the one thing that both eras have always is a hem protector. This is a strip of fabric or braid, usually wool or mohair, that protects the very edge of the skirt so that the hem actually doesn't come in contact with the ground or other surroundings, so that it doesn't fray so easily. And this can be easily changed out for a new one if that wears out. One other thing I want to mention is pockets. Because yes, walking skirts, since they're practical garments, they typically do have pockets in both eras. But because of the difference in the shape, Victorian era walking skirts can have pockets at the sides where we would typically nowadays find pockets, usually at the seam. And they could be slightly lower because skirts wear still fairly tight around the hip area. So you could usually find them slightly below the hip, the fullest point of the hip. And the other place where you could find them both in the Victorian era and where they continued mostly in the Edwardian era is in the very back. At the center back, usually where there's also the opening for the skirt. Of course, the opening could be in different places, and sometimes when the opening changed its place, also the pocket changed its place. But because that's a very convenient place to put it, even if the skirt is very narrow in other places around the hips, because usually there is fullness in the back, because both eras have emphasis on a bigger behind, so there is a little bit of extra volume there, so things can be hidden in a pocket. And especially if you make the pocket slightly more deep, it kind of falls, the things that are in your pocket, they fall past the widest part of your butt, so it doesn't show in the silhouette. And this is also the place where I typically like to put my pockets in, is at the back. And I always get asked this, so I'm going to answer this now. No, I don't actually sit on my phone, even though the pocket is at the center back, because when I sit, the garment kind of lifts the pocket up so that the pocket is just bunched up behind me when I sit, not actually so that there's any danger of me sitting on the pocket.
For my pattern, I used a 9-gore walking skirt from Marquis DE. You draft it using the measurements given in the pattern. It is in centimeters. My fashion fabric is cotton sateen and my lining is rayon. I'm making my hem facing 12 inches deep out of cotton organdy so that it is washable. I sew my hem facing onto the inside of the lining. Then my fashion fabric and lining pieces at the same time together to form a skirt. Then I even out the hem. Then connect 2-inch strips of velvet to form the hem binding. Okay, now when I turn this edge, I want to make sure that there is a good, maybe 1/4 of an inch showing on the right side to protect the hem. Because otherwise, if this is all on this side like this, then this part of the fabric can still get scuffed and then it won't really do its job. So it is very important to leave a little bit of this showing. If I would have wanted it to be like less obvious, I could have used a velvet very similar to this, but because I don't really care, I like the contrast, I am using this one. Next, I make the skirt placket with the pocket. Then I plait the back to match the waistband. And sew the waistband onto the skirt. Lastly, I add a closure to the waistband. And here is the finished skirt. And as you can see, the lining and the hem facing are doing their job, keeping the skirt in that fashionable flared A-line shape. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please hit that like button because it really does help out with the algorithm. And if you haven't already subscribed, you could do that so that I can see you again next time. Bye!